Ahead or Mike, on the proposed legislation, the End of Racial Profiling Act. What is it? What do they ask for, and what's the status? Did it pass? And do we have existing laws that prohibit profiling?
We don't at the federal level. Some states and some cities do. The End Racial Profiling Act is, for all intents and purposes, dead. It was introduced for a decade in Congress, and the Senate co-sponsor, Russ Feingold from Wisconsin, was defeated by a corporate Republican in last fall's elections. Just to illustrate the importance of engaging, he was also the senator who took the lead on trying to impose campaign finance restrictions to keep corporate money from invading elections. And the Supreme Court, which also allowed open season on free speech last year in the Humanitarian Law Project case, also in another case, Citizens United basically said that corporations can own the political process. So I don't see it having many legs anytime soon. Two things on the bill for what it's worth. Even when it was in play, it was also radically under-inclusive. Mike talked about how the 2003 Justice Department guidance on the use of race does not include protections for religion. Neither did IRPA. Moreover, the End Racial Profiling Act also formally disregarded, just as long as we're talking about law here, you'll hear restrictions on police activities, sometimes framed as restrictions on interactions versus activities. The difference is that interactions are searches and seizures. Activities is everything else that includes the things they do to you in secret that you don't know about. So IRPA didn't protect against profiling through surveillance or profiling through monitoring. If you talk to the FBI, they will argue that no amount of surveillance could be profiling because it's not a search. So there's an effort to formalistically define very key terms in limited ways, and IRPA unfortunately conceded that. And so in some respects, while the bill would certainly have been a step forward, the fact that it's not on the table and the opportunity to go back to the drawing board and fashion a meaningful bill might actually be a net positive.
Okay. All right, this is a question for either one of you. There's been a big controversy in this country recently about the porno scanners or being roped in airports, basically. So I'm wondering, what do you think is the best response to dealing with these machines and without getting into profiling? And also how the fear that's generated by these cases, these entrapment sting cases where they say somebody's about to blow something up, how that lends itself to then getting people to accept these kinds of repressive measures in airports and elsewhere.
We actually have a website at the ACLU up on the body scanners, the scope or the grope as we call it. And obviously we oppose the body scanners and the enhanced pat down for privacy reasons. I mean, with so many of these programs, it's not about what is actually an effective security measure. It's really security theater, and that term was mentioned earlier, that this is sort of something to make you think the government is doing something right. But the body scanners, of course, became very popular, and were the implementation of these devices was accelerated after the underwear bomber. But the governments in Europe have tested it and found that it likely would not have discovered that explosive device the way it was hit in the person's underwear. There is evidence that the enhanced pat-down also probably would not have discovered that device. Moreover, there are other terrorists around the world who have used even more interesting ways to secrete devices in body cavities, which of course would not be found with these devices. So it's a device that is not designed to protect against the threat, and yet it violates all of our privacy, or all the traveling public's privacy, and actually prevents a number of people, either people who can't go through the machines or be groped because of religious reasons, or people who are terribly embarrassed because of some kind of medical condition, colostomy bag or some other medical condition, and don't want to be violated that way, and transgender people who don't need that public humiliation and therefore can't fly because they can't get around these machines. And to then use that invasion of privacy as a justification for profiling is exactly contrary. And if you talk to any security officials, there's a security official who ran the Ben Gurion Airport in Tel Aviv who is very strongly that, racial profiling is not an effective method to detect threats. It simply isn't. And, he points out that one of the only attacks at that airport was by a Japanese terrorist, and, obviously would have defeated and did defeat any racial profiling setup. So, it's simply not effective. It's violated people's civil rights, and it shouldn't be used.
So I've got at least 4 things here. I'll try to get through them quickly. So first on the scanners, one of the things that's interesting about the TSA body scanners and the resistance to them is that it has emerged from across the political spectrum. So you have both get off my land types in, say, Texas or Utah, alongside progressives in other places, concerned from a variety of political perspectives about the abuses of privacy. There are different ways that a win might happen, and I think there's a chance that the body scanners might get taken off the table. If it happens because we're actively working across those communities, then we have some resiliency to profiling being inserted as the fallback alternative. If it happens because one community or another pushes independently, then we get thrown under the bus, right? So this is another reason why we have to reach out across communities. The way we win matters as much as what we win, and who we win with, and whether they're with us later, right? So the scanners expose an opportunity of alignment between competing normally views. This gets back to the sort of, the corruption of the process I was saying. We should have everybody lining up. Here you have a populist alignment among people who are skeptical of both the Democratic and the Republican establishments who are in bed with the insert here 3-letter agencies, right? And the question is, can we maintain that populist allegiance beyond a victory, right? If we win on body scanners, does that then mean that we're going to just search brown people, right? And whether or not we win depends on whether or not we convince the folks on the other side who share our interests to care not just about the body scanners, but about us as a community and everybody else. So that's one. 2, data mining. You asked about the predatory prosecutions and how that creates a culture of fear. So just a couple things to riff on there. It encourages profiling not just by counterterrorism agents, but also state and local law enforcement agents pursuing routine criminal law enforcement. So it subjects people to downstream profiling. It also subjects people to private sector discrimination, so whether that's housing or workplace discrimination. It manifests as school bullying and hate crimes. There's a whole bunch of social effects that stem from this contrivance of fear. Another thing, and this is very in the weeds, but follow me here. So another thing it does is skew the counterterrorism apparatus. Okay, so this might be like a minute or 2. I'll be quick. All right, so there's at least 3 problems with profiling, right? And we've talked about 2 of them. The first is over-inclusion. Steve in particular was talking about this, right? This is the idea that we're going after people who present no threat by deeming them, whether on the basis of their religion or their ideology, as a problem, and that's offensive to civil rights, democratic inclusion, a whole bunch of things. There's another problem that Nihad alluded to at the beginning of his introduction to this panel, and that's under-inclusion, right? If you profile the people who look like or talk like this, you're going to miss the people who look like Joseph Stack, or the guy who walks into a church and assassinates a doctor in Kansas City because he, performs abortions. There are a whole bunch of ways in which terrorism happens, and as Sara was saying on the prior panel, whether or not it's recognized as terror or not is politically contrived. So there's an under-inclusion in the omission of potential threats when you profile. So third problem, and this gets back to your point, predatory prosecutions skew the predictive possibility of data mining. So one of the things that intelligence agents are trying to do is look at cases of supposed terrorists. What do they do before they go off and do this? Okay, well, let's go look at people who are doing this, right? And so just to throw an example that the NYPD actually suggested, people in their artificial slice of defendants that they looked at, a lot of them ate falafel, and so the FBI recommended scrutiny of falafel sales. That sounds funny, and it would be if it weren't true. It's insane, right? It's as insane as thinking that espousing extreme views is somehow related to terrorism. Here's the point that answers your question. When we allow predatory prosecutions, when we allow the contrivance of the cases, the hits that then found their way into that equation, right? If the point is we're looking at people who are terrorists to see what they do before, and now we're flooding the pool of people who are deemed terrorists with fake cases, which means we're drawing bad correlations. It poisons the entire enterprise, and it takes what could be potentially effective security, were it based on behavioral profiling of the sort that the IDF advocates and uses at Ben Gurion Airport, It takes what could be effective security and ensures that it will be merely theater.